There's a lot of talk these days of how we live in unprecedented times. And while that is true on one level, at the same time, it's not the first time in history that people have lived under a kind of a lockdown. And it's not the first time it was unsafe to go outside, or that people lived with massive unknowns, not knowing when or even if they could resurface again and come back out in the open. When my mother lived in hiding from Nazi persecution, she didn't know when or even if the war would end, and she didn't know if she would ever see her parents again. The question I ask myself these days as we are living in shelter is, how might my mother's experiences be relevant for what we are living through today? How did a teenage girl of 14, 15 years old survive being in hiding for almost 3 full years? And of course, those 3 years were not a standalone. They were part of a trajectory, a bigger story. A story that began in 1933 when my grandparents and mother fled Nazi Germany and moved to Amsterdam. A story that continued in 1940 when the Nazis invaded and conquered Holland and my mother was 12 years old. There are a few moments in my mother's story that really stand out to me, like the moment when the Jews of Amsterdam realized it would only be a few hours before the Nazis would march into Amsterdam. And there was this mad rush of thousands of people desperately trying to make it to the harbor to get onto the last boat to England. And my mother and grandparents were part of that mad rush of desperate people. And it ended with my mother and grandfather standing on the docks, watching the last boat to England sail away. The boat that had my grandmother on it, but that they didn't make it on. And so there was that moment when they realized they were doomed. Their last escape, their last loophole had just closed. All they could do was return to Amsterdam, which was by now occupied by the Nazis. And so their journey began. A journey that 2 years later led to the next big moment in my mother's life. After having been separated from her mother, my grandmother, she now had to say goodbye to her father. Because as the Nazis were cleansing Holland of Jews, my mother received her own deportation letter. And so my grandfather had to find them false papers with Christian names and without the giant J on it. And he had to find her a place of hiding in the countryside away from the city. And so there she was, a teenage girl hiding out on a farm all alone. I asked myself how she survived, how she made it through without her parents, not knowing if she would ever see them again. And I asked myself how my grandfather survived, running from one hiding place to the next, going from being a prosecutor in Munich to having to hide in someone's cabinet, not being allowed to make any noise because any single noise could have given away his whereabouts and could have cost him his life. How did they survive that kind of terror? I've never been able to ask my mother those questions directly because I've never known her. She died when I was a toddler, and my father, who was a Holocaust survivor himself, never spoke of her again. The way that I discovered my mother's war story was that after my father's death, I was given a box of documents that had been in his dresser for his whole life. And as I scrolled through all those documents, I found the 4-page witness report written by the woman who had helped my mother and grandfather find places of hiding during the war. This was how I found out about the details of their journey, and this was also how I discovered that eventually my grandfather smuggled my mother back into the city because it had become too dangerous in the countryside, and that they in the end were in hiding together on the Prinsengracht, on the same canal as where Anne Frank was hidden, just a 10-minute walk away from her. And the exact address was listed in the document. And so together with my stepmom, we went there and knocked on the door. And so that's how it happened, that 50 years after my mother's passing, I stood in the attic where she and my grandfather had been in hiding. This was where, according to the document, they nearly froze and starved to death. This was where they ate tulip bulbs to survive. And this was the door they walked out of on the day of liberation, where for the first time in nearly 3 years, they could feel the sunlight on their faces again. So how did they survive? The document told me about Gestapo raids and escapes in the middle of the night, but it didn't tell me anything of their emotional realities. It was like finding a key to a door that had always been locked, and you open the door and then you find out, oh, there are all these other doors right behind it that are still locked, that will always be unknown. However, when I meditated on their story and what it was that allowed them to survive, this was what came to me. It was love. Love was what enabled my mother to pull through. Knowing that her father, my grandfather, loved her with all of his heart. He loved her so much, he would do anything for her. He would have given his life for her. And even if she couldn't be with him physically, his love was always with her. And I know that this was what allowed her to pull through. That is what I know in my heart. And love was what she chose after the war. I know that because in the same box of documents, I found the love letters she wrote to my dad in the early 50s, really only a few years after she'd come out of hiding. And what she said to him was that she'd read in various women's magazines that, as a woman, you should always play hard to get and never let a man know how you really feel about him. But she said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to play any games because, who knows? Our relationship may not go anywhere. But I want to know what it's like to love. And so I'm not going to hold anything back. And I'm going to tell you how much I love you. And she ended the letter with sending him 1,001 kisses, more than could ever fit on the page. My mother opened her heart without any guarantees because she wanted to know love for the sake of love itself. Which brings me to the topic of death as an ally. Because I believe that it was exactly because my mother had been so close to death that she was able to choose life and love so wholeheartedly and with so much passion. And I believe there can be value in being forced to face our mortality in such a dramatic way as is happening right now. Because there's something about being closer to death that can break us open, that can awaken us. Wherever we turn these days, there's some form of profound heartbreak and loss. And so the question for me becomes, how can we engage with that process of death and dying in a way that deepens our lives and deepens our relationships and deepens our sense of meaning? Death can be our ally in that it can connect us with what's most essential, most important, and most meaningful. And what's interesting is that even on a consensus reality level, it's only essential services that are allowed to continue these days. And so, what does it mean to live in love with death as our ally? What is most important, most essential, and most meaningful? And what are some of the patterns and ways of engaging that actually may need to die, may need to be let go of? Each of us is going to respond differently to those questions. For my mother, it was about love. And I know that if I asked her if her life was meaningful, she would say yes. Because even though her life was flanked by these two great tragedies of the Holocaust on the one hand and her battle with cancer on the other hand, in between those two, she loved with all of her heart. And so maybe it's more about letting these questions infuse our lives than it is about answering them. Because letting those questions infuse our interactions with ourselves and with other people has the potential to transform every moment and every realm of our lives. How we create intimacy and how we resolve conflict. How we engage emotionally, sexually, and spiritually. How we relate to nature. How we relate to our creativity and our sense of meaning and purpose, and so forth. What does it mean to live and love with death as our ally? I feel that this is the question that life has invited us into, not as something to answer, but as a portal into new possibilities. And my sense is we are in the portal. Or as my partner Robert would say it, we are in the alchemical pot. And death is stoking the fires, metaphorically speaking. And the message that I'm hearing in a kind of single-minded, arrow-like way goes something like this. Wake up to what is most important, most essential, and most meaningful.